According to AdoptionNetwork.com, there are 428,000 children in foster care in the United States. More than 60% of children in foster care spend 2 to 5 years there before being adopted. 135,000 children are adopted in the United States every year, and of course, many children are never are adopted. My guest today, author Rachel Howard's new book, The Risk of Us, tells the gripping, moving story of one couple's journey as they undertake the process of potentially adopting a foster child. I'm going to talk with Rachel about foster care, adoption, and how the couple in her book navigates it all in The Risk of Us. So don't go anywhere. Matthew Felix on Air starts now. Welcome to Matthew Felix on Air, people who create, people who make a difference, coming to you from WordSpace Studios in San Francisco, California. Happy Father's Day. I hope all the dads out there are having a good one. A busy couple of weeks. This weekend, I released a few new episodes of my Travelers on Travel podcast and Words and Images podcast as well. Those podcasts are both collections from before my show moved from the internet radio station to the studio where I do it currently. The Travelers on Travel episodes that I released, there are 3 of them. The first one is episode 10, which is Bucket List on a Budget. And that was a fun, interesting, inspiring conversation I had with Ryan Waters. And he is the Before You Die guy. And he talks about how travel changed him, how to do bucket list travel on a budget, and some of the destinations where he's been. Snow monkeys in Japan, whale sharks in Mexico, lots of other different destinations. So that was a fun episode. Second episode, episode 11 that I just re-released, is a refugee camp in Greece. So Northern California journalist Kathy Miller went to a Greek island and spent a few weeks volunteering at a refugee camp. And so I talked to her about her experience there, about life in the camp, about the refugee crisis, and lots more. So that was an important episode that's just as relevant now, of course, as it was back then. And the third episode that I released of the Travelers on Travel series is one that is also in my Words and Images series, but it's sort of half about writing, half about travel, so I decided to include it here. And this is writer Erin Byrne, who most of you who listen and watch this show are already well familiar with because she's been on a few times. But she talks about seeking Duende, in Spain, finding inspiration in France, and how culture clash leads to personal growth. So that was another great episode. The last episode that I'll mention is from my Words and Images podcast, and that's where I talk. Those talks are basically focused on writers, photographers, and filmmakers. And this particular episode is on writing workshops. And so I talked with Traveler's Tales publisher and travel writer Larry Habiger about a workshop that he was getting ready to lead in Morocco. So we talked a little bit about Morocco as well, but also just writing workshops in general. The different approaches to workshops, what people get out of them, that sort of thing. So especially if you're a writer interested or thinking about, haven't workshopped before, thinking about doing it, a good conversation for along those lines. Okay, next week, actually no show next week, but the following week, June 30th, my guest will be Guide Dogs for the Blind CEO and President, Christine Benninger. I have been interested in that organization for a long time. As I've mentioned in the past, I regularly pet sit for a career change. A pooch who was almost a guide dog ended up having a career change. I see them training a lot when I'm in San Rafael, and so I've wanted to have them on the show for a long time. So I'm excited that Chris is going to be here, and we're going to talk all about that organization and the amazing work that they do. And then I'll go on hiatus for a little while, but I'll talk about that for the summer, basically. So I'll talk about that June 30th. All right, no doubt much more to be said, but it's time to get to our show. So after this quick message from my host and sponsor, WordSpace Studios, I will be back with author Rachel Howard. A quick thanks to WordSpace Studios in San Francisco for sponsoring Matthew Felix on Air. WordSpace's mission is to bring together writers and thinkers of all ages and experiences. WordSpace will soon be offering creative writing workshops, a literary book club, and guided writing groups. And WorksPace is already offering writing residencies. They are submission-based, and they provide writers with room and board for up to 1 month. To find out more, you can email info@wordspaceststudios.com. Rachel Howard is a graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College and fellow of the MacDowell Colony. Her fiction and nonfiction has appeared in Ziziva, O Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and lots of other prestigious publications. Rachel's first book was a memoir, The Lost Night, about which she was interviewed by Ira Glass on NPR's This American Life. Rachel lives in Nevada City, California, where she founded Yuba Writers Workshops and a reading series, Yuba Lit, which is now fiscally sponsored by the Nevada County Arts Council. Rachel teaches through Stanford Continuing Studies, where she created a writing about spirituality course with readings about a multiplicity of faith traditions. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for making the drive down.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. Yeah. So let's just jump right into it. How and why did you get started writing?
Oh, all the way back to starting.
We're going to go back really far.
That's great.
Yeah, let's this is going to be a comprehensive interview.
Wow.
I hope you don't have anywhere to be. Yeah.
No, I started really when I was about 10.
Oh wow. We are going far back.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember your first work?
I do. I mean, I remember that I wrote a short story for my 4th grade class after we had gone to the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
Oh, nice.
And it was about a whale, and it needed a home, and the aquarium had to be so big that all the countries had to come together to build the aquarium on top of multiple countries. And
wow.
And I remember just really enjoying that story and having an idea at 10 years old that what if I could be a writer. And at the same time, I really loved solitude. And luckily, my home at that time with my mom and my stepdad, the bedroom had come with a desk that was too large to be moved. It was a huge L-shaped desk, and it just felt like I'm meant to be a person who spends a lot of time in her room at her desk.
So it was preordained from very early on. I started journaling, I remember, in, I think, 4th grade. So I don't know how old you are then. But yeah, way back. Yeah. Oh, so it's the same time. I didn't have a big desk, but I love that the house just came with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I started journaling at that time too.
Yeah.
I would put things down on slips of paper and then hide them in boxes and hide them in my room. And then I had some lapses in journaling, but I started again when I was 17. And that journal I have written in every 2 to 3 days, usually not more than 4 days passes between entries, continuously since I was 17.
To this day.
Yeah.
So where do you store them all?
I actually, because in Nevada County, we're really worried about fire now with everything that's going on. I just bought 3 big fireproof safes and put all my journals in them.
I love that.
Love
that. That just today.
Yeah.
Wow. How timely.
Yeah.
How timely. Wow. 3 fireproof safes.
Yeah.
That's, I have one, what's it called? Trunk, but it's not fireproof, but I live in the city. It's earthquake proof. But wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. I feel, I don't know if I should feel bad about it. Like, it seems kind of selfish. Like, the thing that I care about the most that I'm going to put in the safe is all my journals. But at the same time, I know I'm devastated if I lost them all.
But the other thing is, and we weren't going to talk about this at all, so we're already completely off our schedule. So people watching, listening, hopefully you'll find this interesting. But you could say, yeah, it's narcissistic because, oh my God, I'm preserving. And yet we're writers.
That's the problem.
And so I do go back to those journals, and there is information there, and there is inspiration there. There's insight there. So I don't know that it's really, it would be, I don't know. It seems like given our profession, our vocation, we at least are, maybe that's just a self-serving way of seeing it. But I mean, you might actually use these, right?
No, I do use
them. And you do use them.
Actually, yeah, I'm working on another memoir now, so even more so than the couple of years that I was working on this.
I think you're fine having just invested. Because imagine, you're working your book. I mean, I don't even want to say this about the fires. You know what I just got in the mail yesterday? Speaking of fires, again, we're going already on a 3rd major tangent. I got a mask. One of those high-end masks, because last year and the year before, I didn't have the masks. They sold out right away. And so I was just using the scarf, and so it matters. So point being, you need to protect those things because there's a real danger, especially where you live, even more.
Yeah, I was trying to be realistic, and I was kind of haunted by Maxine Hong Kingston was a a guest reader at St. Mary's College a couple years ago when I was guest teaching at their MFA program, and she talked about losing her novel in the Oakland Hills fire.
Oh, God. Her whole novel?
Her whole novel, which she rewrote.
Because she only did it by hand or typewriter or something? She didn't have electronic...
I think it was just her computer burned up, too.
Everything the actual burned computer. Up. Oh, yeah. She didn't save to the cloud or... Oh, God.
Right. Well, it was before that.
Before we
all
even
of
thinking.
That. And
yeah.
so, Maxine Hong Kingston lost a whole book and rewrote it. And so that made it real to me.
That hurts. That makes it very real.
Yeah.
Very real. Yeah. Okay. Wow. I'm glad she was able to kind of redo it, though, and didn't just throw in the towel and say, I can't. Because I would have that question, right? I'd be like, I just spent all that time. Can I even try to recreate that? And do I even... I don't know. I guess if the story's so compelling and you still feel that need to tell that story, I guess.
Well, the despair would be a high challenge for me. I don't know that I would do it, but Maxine Hong Kingston, being who she was, she completely reinvented the book, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get back on track here. All that was really interesting. Okay. At least for me here. So we're still going to talk about your background a little bit before we get into the book, because you said something really interesting, speaking of education and becoming a writer. And you said something interesting specifically in the acknowledgments to The Risk of Us. I'm going to quote you twice here already. Quote, I owe so much of the program for writers at Warren Wilson College for converting me to writing as a life of suitable silence before mystery and faith in particulars. So I want to read that one more time for the audience because I just thought that was beautiful, and that just really stood out for me. So for converting me to writing as a life of suitable silence before mystery and faith in particulars. Can you kind of just briefly touch on what you were thinking or what you were saying with that?
Yeah, I mean, Warren Wilson was, I sound like a total cult member every time I talk about it.
Yeah.
It was a conversion experience for me, and I didn't expect that going in.
Yeah.
I had already published a memoir, my memoir about my father's unsolved murder, which I wrote just by reading.
The Lost Year?
The Lost Night.
Lost Night, yep.
Yeah. I wrote that just by reading as much as I could and being in a writing group, which had some excellently insightful members who helped me along with that book. So I already had a book in the world, and I had worked as a journalist, and I was wanting, though, I knew I needed more help and deeper apprenticeship for what I wanted to do with fiction. So that's why I went to Warren Wilson, and it was humbling. My first advisor there told me, I'm going to break you down and put you back together. And I thought,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I thought, well, maybe she doesn't know how advanced I am and that I don't need that. And it was utterly what I needed. And I ended up learning the most there from the poets, because in that low residency format, you go for a 10-day stint, which I kind of thought at the time was like, oh, you hang out with other writers and you drink wine and you watch the sunset. But it was like this grueling 9 o'clock in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, workshops and classes and lectures, and then meeting with your supervisor, and then readings. And then it was really, they push you hard.
And you're a writer when 9 o'clock is grueling.
Yeah.
Because I feel the exact same way. I know. But there's a sign. We know she's legit. Not that we doubted, but she's like, you're not going to believe this. At 9 a.m. They made us start working at 9 a.m. So I'm sorry. Continue.
No. Well, but so all the fiction writers go to the poet lectures, and the poets go to the fiction writers lectures, and vice versa. And I just found that I was learning so much more from the poetry lectures because of that emphasis on the particular. And not about explaining things, not about structuring information, not about telling people what you think you already know, but creating a container, a shape, a form to just hold something that is more than we can explain or understand, and brought that into fiction. Yeah.
I tried to write some poetry a while back that will never see the light of day, and I should probably put in one of your safes just to make sure that it never does. But just that experience of trying to use language, see things, reality, life from that different, and express it so much differently just helped inform kind of my own relationship with language and expression. And like I said, even though the poetry will not be read, it was a really good exercise and very helpful in that sense. Yeah.
I am not a poet. I wrote one poem in my life, and I sent it to some poet friends to help me with it. And I realized I was not going to write more, but I venerate
it's good to know
them.
our strengths.
I venerate them for that reason. But yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think also like I had like Stuart Dybek had a way of describing, his short stories. And I'm not sure who he said this to, but he said it's a difference between wanting to express something and wanting to make something. And so like even a short story is not about expressing something. It's about making something that has a shape and that contains something that's irreducible.
I love that.
Yeah,
it makes sense. Let's talk about one other thing sort of in your education leading up to the conversation we're going to have about the book that again is not something that people would necessarily on the surface think is going to inform your writing, but it really did. And this is your art modeling.
Yeah.
And I just found this fascinating when I was reading about this. And so this is something that you did when you were to help support yourself when you were getting started out, as we all do, take all these different odd jobs and things like that. And so you became an art model. And in a 2013 New York Times article, you introduce, or you touch on that experience. And I'm just going to kind of fast forward and read through a part of that to give people a sense. So 5 years ago, I walked into a third-floor art studio on the campus of UC Berkeley. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, too, in the interest of time. Climbed atop a wooden stage and dropped my yellow bathrobe. A panel of strangers asked me to pose and then to freeze. I had never modeled for artists and had no idea how I would feel standing naked as people I had just met stared at me. The idea had some bohemian appeal, but I needed to supplement my income. Fast forward, she becomes a model, and then I soon grew to love the freedom and strange relinquishment of status that comes from offering your nude presence to artists. What inspired me the most, though, was how profoundly it changed my writing life. So that, again, was just a really long way of me rephrasing that question, so how did it inform your writing life?
Oh, boy.
And again, that's probably a whole other episode.
No,
but at a high level,
art modeling was the best thing I ever did for my writing and for my life. And I wish that I still did it. I can't, just because I live in a small town now.
Yeah.
When you're here and you're in a big town, you can kind of float around for different groups, and it's
vanish afterwards.
Exactly. Have this certain intimacy that's in a constructed space, and then go live your other life.
Right.
And you can't do that where you see everybody at the same grocery store every day.
Right.
How did it change my writing life? Just the analogies to painting, to seeing the whole, rather than thinking of just information being restructured to create some kind of linear argument or delivery of information, which is what I was used to from journalism, which is all about efficiency of handing something off that's well organized versus, like I was talking about with Stuart Dybek, creating a thing so that, even though writing unfolds page after page rather than taking it all in on a canvas at once, it has a composition. It has a wholeness to the story that you see, and you try to grasp that wholeness in your imagination and get that wholeness down as fast as you can so that things organically connect. So even, I just started thinking more in painting analogies, which just with this particular book was actually really helpful, because with The Risk of Us, part of what I wanted to do was this experience of adopting a foster child, trying to gain the trust of a child who has no good reason to trust you, was really beautiful one moment and really painful and scary in the next.
Right.
And
We're
those
talk about that.
Yeah, and those just stand next to each other.
Yeah.
And so coming back to my art modeling experience and just being around artists, I started to think of that as a pointillist technique, like a Seurat painting, that you could have the different colors and the dots stand next to each other. You don't have to bleed the colors together. You don't have to bleed the beautiful and the scary together. They're just existing side by side. But then when you step back, you see the bigger picture.
Which gets me to, I'm not going to ask this yet, but I can, now that you say that, I see that in how you structured The Risk of Us, with these moments. And like I said, we'll get to that. But that's interesting. That's really interesting. The one thing I want to add about the, again, quoting you about your time as an art model, This is from a 2013 essay called Losing Things that you published in Barefoi. And you're talking about your husband did a drawing, a nude portrait of you, and you hung this up on a billboard. Or not a billboard.
Oh, heavens.
Yeah, she got really comfortable with her.
Yeah.
No, on your bulletin board.
That was a very effective ad for my book.
Exactly. Through the roof. Sales went through the roof. That's funny. This is why we like doing this live. No, on your bulletin board. And then the quote that I really liked about that is you said, quote, in this essay, Losing Things, quote, I pinned that drawing. And you're asking yourself, why did I pin that in the middle of my bulletin board? And your response to yourself was, I pinned that drawing there to remind myself always to be naked, which I loved. And just that idea of what you had learned from being vulnerable and just having that constant reminder. Is it a gross overstatement to say that there's a parallel, or a gross overstatement of the obvious to say that there's a parallel between exposing yourself in the flesh and exposing yourself on the page? That there's...
Yeah, not from me. I mean, that's the heart of my process. That's like who I decided to be as a writer.
Yeah.
And I really like made a conscious choice about that and like pinned up on my bulletin board because I lost my way in my writing for a while, and I kind of lost sense of what were my real qualities that I had to offer, and what was my temperament and my sensibility. And so I had a moment where I regrouped and tried to write down what do I feel are my essential qualities that I can bring, and nakedness and vulnerability were up there. And I wrote down a list and I pinned it to my bulletin board. Actually, the portrait is no longer on the bulletin board, but now the list is.
Okay, that works. That works instead. All right. One more question. I don't know. I say one more. Maybe I have a couple more. Let me No, one more question before we get to the risk of us. And this is actually a nice segue into that. The line between nonfiction and fiction. So I'm not going to ask you about, okay, what's fiction, what's nonfiction in The Risk of Us, right? But it's obvious there are many, many glaring similarities between yourself and your real life and the protagonist and the life that she has in the novel. So like I said, I'm not interested in picking apart what's true, what's not, obviously. But what I am interested in is, as a writer, navigating that line between, you could have chosen, for example, to have the protagonist be much different than you. So can you just kind of talk about, and I'm sure you must have gotten this question before because the similarities are so obvious. So can you talk a little bit about any sort of angle on that, whether it's kind of why you chose to make them so similar, or how you navigate that line and don't necessarily, because I can see a lot of people might just try to assume that this, because it's so similar, that this is not fiction. So how do you navigate all that? I'm just curious about that whole...
I'm constantly thinking about all of these things.
Yeah. What's your latest thinking? Yeah.
Well, to me, they are different modes of consciousness almost, and a different relationship with the reader that I bring to the page. So I'm back writing memoir now. Yep. And I've had to be very aware of the relationship with the reader in that, but it's different than fiction. Which has to have its own internal coherence. Nothing outside of the world that's in the pages can matter. So any correspondence to what you've lived has to be absolutely coincidental, even in your imagination. So I do actually sometimes now think that I have, because I did mix some things that I have lived and things that I have not lived, and with all the characters in the book, there's things that are true to real life people and not. I sometimes think that I've lived experience I haven't because I invented it for the book. And when I'm in that space, I also don't keep track. Yep. Which is very different with memoir. I definitely keep track. I'm not one of those memoirists who is okay with intentional invention. I'm my own ethic about that.
Yeah, creative nonfiction, taking a little more liberty.
Yeah. My own ethic with that is that I don't take liberty. I really try to be true to what I can reconstruct, and I don't deliberately invent things. Yeah. So, I mean, I think with this book, part of the process was I really stopped and thought about who are my influences, what am I really drawn to, what really lights up my imagination, the writers that matter the most to me, And a lot of them were working in this way where you felt this ambiguity of, was this their life or wasn't it in their fiction?
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it was sort of deliberate.
It was deliberate.
You liked that sort of ambiguity.
Yeah. I decided, like, Marguerite Duras, I'm the lover, I'm drawn back to that in part because it has this intentional ambiguity of how much did she live. Even though when I'm in the book, it feels internally consistent and it, succeeds in that way. It still has that charge. Jean Rhys, really influenced by her novels and her as well. Sheila Heti, using her own name and her friends' own names. But then if you read all interviews about her process, she would write scenes and then put the contents of the scenes in a description on an index card, reshuffle them and combine scenes and then rewrite new scenes out of that. So you could no longer say what she had lived or what she hadn't, even though she's still using her own name.
And her friends' names. And
then there's some other writers who aren't quite pushing it that overtly, but Peter Orner, recently I read his new story in the Paris Review, which is lovely, called Ineffectual Tribute to Lynn, just came out in the last Paris Review issue. It's in there as fiction. The character seems to have the last name Orner, though, and he's a writer who's supposed to produce another novel for Little Brown. And
sounds very familiar.
Yeah, so where is the line in there? So it was definitely a deliberate decision.
Interesting. Well, and I'll say what I deliberately did before this interview is, certain questions that I had wondering, well, is that really her? Does she really have a daughter? Did she really adopt a daughter? Did she really, different things did that really happen? And I deliberately didn't try to find out. Because for this interview, and then I have a lot of questions off camera afterwards, but for this interview, I wanted just to be, okay, this is the book. This is, and I didn't want to be informed by anything that I may or may not have known. But that's interesting that you sort of, deliberately liked that ambiguity and went for that ambiguity. Interesting. Okay. It was more deliberate than I realized. Yeah. I mean, I knew you were aware that you were doing it, but there's that idea of really sort of relishing that, like you said, like Marguerite Duras, okay. Which brings us to the book. You thought we were never going to get there, but now we're here. Can you give us, listeners and viewers and myself, an overview, just an introduction to what the book's about? We've kind of danced around it a little bit, but can you tell us kind of the elevator summary or whatever? Yeah.
I'm so bad at elevator pitches too.
Okay, don't mess it up. Don't mess it. Hey, this isn't the first time you've done this. Actually, I expect this to be polished. No pressure.
I mean, I will say though that this book is much easier for me to quote unquote elevator pitch because it just came to me with a clear container. This is where it will start. This is where it will end. This is what it's essentially about. This is what the driving question is about, and I can walk that line. Yeah. And so my novel that I worked on for 7 years that was never published before this, I could never give an elevator pitch to because it didn't have all of that clarity of elements.
Interesting.
When I started work on it.
Which is maybe a sign, right? If we can't succinctly kind of get that down to those essential elements, maybe that's because we haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I mean, you don't want to take that to heart so seriously that a possibly promising project, like material that you're really drawn to, right, that you kill it before you
want to give it a chance.
You have to let it be that messy for a while. I couldn't come up with
that. No, it's got to be messy at first.
I mean, because it is going to be rare that it just comes to you with the elements
like this one
so clear, which just was a freak occurrence in this case. Yeah. But I do think, when it's not working, my main breakthrough over the last 7 years was to say I had to define for myself what is the essential driving human dilemma level question. And if the one that I thought I was working with isn't pulling this together as a form, then I need to rethink what that question could be. But anyway, about this book, it was really clear. So it's about a couple in their 40s. Actually, the husband's in his 50s in my imagination in the book. I don't think you know that on the page.
I don't think we know that.
But they, it's the second marriage for each of them. Yep. And they both want to adopt a child out of foster care. And they move from San Francisco to the foothills to do that. And they meet 7-year-old Marisa, who has already been in 4 or 5 homes. And they're promising that they're going to be the quote unquote forever home for her.
Although you say they're promising, but they're not sure in the beginning though. I mean, that's part of their, because do they tell her that in the beginning? Because that's a lot of their struggle is, and a lot of what we don't know as readers is whether or not that's ultimately going to happen. You're telling that they're saying that to themselves. They're hoping that that's what will happen.
Yeah. No, they're saying it to themselves. That's their intention. And so a lot of the system itself is, I just felt like it's just ripe for fiction. So
we're going to talk about the system.
Yeah.
Yes. Because a lot of how you feature the system, it's fascinating and it's heartbreaking but yeah, like I said, we'll get to that. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So couple, Foothills, they're hoping that this adoption will work out. She's already been through some other stuff.
Yeah, and so it starts when she moves in.
Yeah.
And then I knew that it's going to go to, they're either going to be able to take this from foster care to finalizing adoption, or it's not going to happen. And probably for this family, it's going to happen within 1 year to 2 years. Mm-hmm. So that was a nice, clear container for the story.
Yep.
These characters have a life beyond that. I don't have to worry about that life before or beyond that for the story, because what matters for the plot here is it's going to peak. They're either going to be able to go down to the courthouse and make this official, or she's going to move on to a new placement, as unimaginable as that seems.
Right.
And that's going to be the turning point.
So why foster care and adoption as the main focus?
Yeah. Well, so we were just beginning to get into the system. So I did adopt a child out of foster care and knew nothing about the system before I started wanting to do that. And just the tensions inherent to an inherently difficult situation. Mm-hmm. And that is just prime material for fiction to investigate. Like in real life, we don't want to be in these terribly tense situations where it feels like there's no good resolution and we don't know which way it's going to go. We run from those as fast as we can, and that's why we put them into fiction, where we can vicariously experience them, hopefully learn something from them.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of the surface level setup for the story. But when I heard you read twice, which is lucky for me because that's how I got to invite you here today, because I heard you read twice. But when you read the first time, or maybe even both times, but I remember the first time specifically, you said, the book it's about adoption. It's about this couple that tries to bring this foster child into their home to see if they can make this work. But you said it's also really about something else.
Yeah. So part of what I knew from the beginning was I knew this will probably work as a story if I put everything into this, because it's about what is unconditional love.
That's what I was looking for. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that's what they're promising her. And then it comes up very quickly in the novel. She goes out with a friend and she's describing what they're going to try to do to have this little girl become part of their family. And he's saying, well, what if it doesn't work out? And she says, well, we're supposed to be offering unconditional love.
Right. That's already on like page 3.
Yeah.
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 Which is a beautiful thing to want to offer. Actually quite difficult to set yourself up to deliver on that.
And we're going to talk a lot more about that, because I love that that's the underlying theme, and you actually addressed that theme in a few different ways. So that's going to come back up in our conversation. But for now, in the spirit of just staying somewhat surface level, can you give just quick introductions to the three main characters in the book?
Oh, okay. So there's the woman who is trying to adopt.
What's her name again? And
she doesn't have a name.
I was preparing last night, and I thought, oh shit, did I miss her name? And I started to flip through the book, and I thought, I'm pretty sure it's not there. And if it is, I'll just ask before the interview. But sometimes, because I'm so visual, sometimes the name will be mentioned and I'm just seeing the person and I don't attach to that. And I flipped through some pages and I thought, no, I'm pretty sure it's not in there.
No,
so I'm glad to know. Okay,
yeah,
so
it's not.
Can I ask why?
So that just happened organically.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Part of what made the book come fast is that this voice of the woman speaking, to first trying to speak to her husband and then trying to speak to Marisa, the little girl, and then trying to speak to both of them. And that when that voice came to me and I started walking that line, I got a certain point in and I was like, I haven't used her name and I haven't needed to. And then I thought, you know what? I actually really like that because this book is about the mother trying to do the adopting, which I actually feel the person who matters the most is the child. Mm-hmm. So it's not I was uneasy with the fact that it's her speaking it, and that it's her angle on the story, because I feel like the adoptees and the foster children's experience matters more. Mm-hmm. They are the most vulnerable people in this situation, and there was a kind of way in which I wanted to honor that. They also, the little girl Marisa is holding the most pain, and as I got into the book and I started re-entering the book every day, I almost wanted to make it a space like a cathedral or a church where you could walk in and things that are painful are held as sacrosanct.
As they are, in fact, in one point in the book.
Yeah. And then the cathedral ended up coming into the book in that way. So I was uneasy, given that was the pain and the person who mattered the most, that it's the mother speaking it. And so I felt like the only way I earn this for myself is if it's the mother speaking it, but it's in an almost paradoxical way, not really about her. Mm-hmm. It's got to be about something bigger than her, right, even though she's the its angle on it that's triangulating it. Yeah. And so then I thought, I really like that her name doesn't show up, because it sort of reinforces that notion that it's not actually about her.
Well, I didn't miss the name. Yeah. You know, like I said, it was only when I started to prepare for today that I realized, oh, wait, did I miss something here? And I would say, just to the point you made a second ago, it would be fascinating if you could have told this story from Marisa's perspective, but
maybe
that would be
book.
A whole, part two. But that would also, I think, be quite the undertaking. I mean, particularly given that she's 7 years old.
Right. Yeah. She's not at an age to really understand it in the way that the adults in this book are. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so just quickly then, Sebastian and Marisa, just to give people a quick idea.
Sebastian, the husband, he's an artist, art teacher. He has a kind of gloomy side, as a pessimistic
as artists
view of life.
Often do. Yeah. Sure.
He's an adjunct, so he's barely supporting himself. And then the narrator is a writer and a writing teacher, and she's not making bank either. So
as is often the case.
Yes, and they're both trying to hang on also to that creative aspect of themselves as they're entering parenting, which is also not easy and a challenge for each of them. Yeah, he's a big fan of Samuel Beckett.
Okay.
And he has his also. They have their difficulties in the marriage. I think it's a good marriage, and they're both happy they're with each other, and yet every marriage
except for when she's doing the dishes.
Except when she's doing the dishes.
Now I really read the book. And I'd be annoyed too. Actually, well, I can't say anything. Yeah, I'm familiar with that dynamic. Let's just say that. Okay. Marisa has gone through a lot of trauma. So it would be one thing, to write this book. It's already challenging enough just bringing a foster child into your home and then trying to undertake the adoption process and seeing, do the personalities mesh? There are a whole bunch of variables at play there, right? But as you talk about in the book, there a lot of these foster kids, a big percentage, have lots of different kinds of trauma. And so trauma is very present throughout this book. And can you tell me just a little bit about how Marisa's trauma plays out in this dynamic with this family that's, this couple that's trying to bring her in?
Yeah, well, this was another thing inherent to foster care that I just thought, man, this is territory for fiction. Because they actually can't, in the foster care situation, you can't necessarily know where the trauma's coming from. This person is coming to you with a history, things that were bad enough to have them removed from their parent. Hopefully they were rightfully removed from their parent.
A whole other issue, right?
A whole other issue, but that's what we hope, is that if you're doing the adopting, it's because this person actually really does need to be adopted.
Yeah.
But you're not necessarily going to know exactly what happened. And so then there's a lot of guesswork when the panic attacks and the trauma starts getting acted on, where is it coming from?
Right.
And how do I actually help with it?
Well, and in this case, the trauma in question that permeates the story isn't even just with Marisa. Also, the woman has undergone, the protagonist, the narrator, has undergone her own trauma. So now we've got this cocktail of intense. So how does bringing this traumatized child into her home, how does that interact with the trauma that she had before? Because there are lots of different answers to that question. I'll just let you answer that. Rather than I was going to elaborate on that. And I was like, wait, I'm going to start answering her question. Go ahead. Yeah. So, because there's a lot going on there.
Oh, I would love to hear your reflections on it. But
you go first.
I will just say quickly that I knew that I had a novel when that element came in. So actually the first pages that I wrote in my notebook about this novel were about the narrator's relationship to her ex-husband,
yeah,
which you also learn about quickly in the novel because, the narrator, this is something I drew on from my own life. Her father was murdered when she was a little girl.
Yep.
I didn't shy from using that, even though it corresponds to my own life. And she went through a period later of panic attacks, anxiety, a lot of acting out against romantic partners and not trusting that they were going to be there for her and that unconditional love was going to come to her from them. She tested her ex-husband to the utmost, and he, poor guy, decided to withstand it and married her.
Yeah.
And she realized after she married him that she had done it for the safety and the security, but that she shouldn't really be married to him. And so the guilt of that is haunting her. And then it creates this really interesting hall of mirrors with, well, okay, if adoption is also like a marriage in a way, this little girl, Marisa, I want to finalize, I don't want her to, in a sense, marry me for the wrong reasons. What if she doesn't actually love me, but she's doing it because she has to, and then she has to just convince herself, pretend to herself that she loves me? I wouldn't want that for her for the rest of her life.
Right. There are so many interesting parallels that you make there, and I'm just going to let the readers read it. But throughout the story, I mean, there are different parallels that come out related to their respective traumas. Do we have a gunfire going on outside? What is that?
I see it. It's fireworks.
Oh, fireworks? Okay.
I don't know if the viewers can see it, but there's sparkles over there.
Okay. As long as we're safe here, it just sounded weird through my headset, so I wanted to make sure there's nothing. All right.
It's reassuring that I just saw
that you can
fireworks.
see it. Okay, good.
And I wonder what they're celebrating.
Anyone who is watching and hearing the sound, we are safe here in WordSpace Studios. There's no need to panic. But it just kept going on, so I just wanted to check in on that. Okay. Speaking of trauma. But then, because there are other angles here, which again, in the interest of time, I won't go into too deeply, but then there's questions about, well, if the mother has gone through this trauma of her own, then the daughter's going to trigger that. Maybe she's not suitable as a parent. So this comes up in lots of different ways throughout. But one thing I do want to touch on here, I'm not sure how eloquently I'm going to do this. I like how the trauma, because if the overriding theme here is unconditional love, and is that possible? And by having the trauma, both in the case of the daughter and the case of the protagonist, it makes the conditions that much more intense, right? I mean, it's one thing. It's just this girl that we're going to adopt. It's another. Well, yeah, but she's got this, and this, and we're going to be waking up in the middle of the night with screaming, and it really, really puts this idea of unconditional to that much more of a test, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. I want to change gears here quickly and I'm just looking at the time here and talk about, I just want to throw out some adoption facts. I mentioned a few at the very beginning, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about the system in particular. But I want to throw out some facts because they're fascinating and, of course, super relevant to our conversation. So I mentioned in the intro to today's show just a couple. I'm going to reiterate a couple and then share a few more. These are from the adoptionnetwork.com. I hope that's a good site. To be honest, I was lazy. It was 2:30 last night, and that's just the one that came up with facts that looked good. So hopefully this is a reliable source. But according to adoptionnetwork.com, 428,000 children there are 428,000 children in foster care in the United States. 135,000 children are adopted every year in the United States. Males outnumber females. African American children are disproportionately represented. Over half are 6 years old or older. More than 60% of children in foster care spend 2 to 5 years there before being adopted. The average age for children waiting to be adopted is 8, like the protagonist in this, or the girl in the story who's 7 turns to 8, I think, during the story. Many, of course, are never adopted. There are 1.5 million adopted children in the United States, and around 7 million Americans are adopted. U.S. citizens completed almost 20,000 international adoptions in 2007, but that number declined to about 9,000 in 2011, just 4 years later, about in half, when international adoptions became much more restrictive. Today, 60 to 70% of adoptions are open adoptions, which means there's a degree of openness and disclosure of information between adoptive and birth parents regarding the adopted child. All right. So, like I said, just a few facts about adoption, because I thought that was really relevant and interesting, and just kind of contextualizes this bigger stuff that we're talking about here. But so before, I just said we were going to talk about the system, but actually I want to talk about the couple and sort of their motivations and their sort of gearing up to adopt. I thought it was interesting that they weren't even sure why they wanted to adopt. I thought that was interesting. And there's a quote on page 55. The narrator is saying, "What a solid reason to do this, to help someone. In the face of the unanswerable why of parenthood, we could stake ourselves on that justification." So I thought that was, so what is the unanswerable why of parenthood, not being a parent? And two, I just thought it was interesting, justification, because it seems like, yeah, you're helping this kid. Do you need to justify? So can you just speak to that a little bit? I thought that was interesting.
That is so interesting, because that actually was a passage that came in the revisions I did were fairly surgical, which I'm sure will never happen to me again. But I also had some terrific feedback from 2 agents that I worked with before working with my editor at Houghton Mifflin. And that passage came in because I was working with this wonderful agent. Of the 2 agents, she was younger and in her 20s. And I think that your relationship to the why parenthood, I think it's so contingent on what time of your life you're in. And it was great to have her eye on the novel, because she was saying, why do they want to be parents at all?
Interesting.
Which actually hadn't occurred to me until that point in the draft.
Okay.
And that brought in some of those meditations in that chapter.
Okay. I love that. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that part of what bonded Sebastian and the narrator of this novel is that they both were people who deeply wanted to be parents in an irrational or not needed to be rationalized place in their minds for many years before they met each other. And I think there's that passage in there about how she saw his vintage children's books and she knew that he wanted a kid. Right, Heidi.
Yep.
Yeah. So they definitely have always wanted it.
Yeah.
But not everyone has.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So also, before we talk about this system, I wanted to talk about then, okay, so they want to have kids, so they've known this for a long time, if not almost always, like you said. But they also, there's a lot of fear associated with adoption. And this is before they even know Marisa, just in general. And so one of the things that I think is really relevant about the book, one of the many, many things that's relevant about the book, is how you highlight the fears that they have going into this, which I assume are fears that so many who would be going into this would have. So can you talk about some of the things some of the fears that potential adoptive parents have as they start to go into this? Relative to the child and relative to actually having this new person in there.
Well, I mean, I think it's only healthy to be realistic going in. So that's part of the reason I wrote the book. I mean, actually, the only reason I wrote the book is because, to be perfectly honest,
that's what we expect here.
When you're a writer and you love fiction from such a young age, and you love what fiction can do, and that it can hold impossible to reconcile things, and it can hold them in this larger sphere of reconciliation. Like when a story comes to you that holds that, that's what fiction is for. So that's what you do. Yeah. And then whatever comes of that, you can't even think about, because if you bring any agenda into it, it won't be doing that thing anymore that fiction can do. It will be doing the agenda. So you had to you cannot bring any agenda into it.
Yeah.
So it's funny because people ask me, like, why did you write the book? And did you do it because you wanted to help people who might become foster parents, or to encourage more foster parents? And now I can say I do have a desire that I hope it encourages more people to do this kind of adopting.
But that wasn't the motivation.
But to be completely honest, I could not have any agenda while I was writing it.
And yet, and I totally get that, and I believe that, but simply by virtue of the story you're telling, the characters do have certain fears, and those fears do happen to coincide with reality. And one that I found really interesting is, it's already on page 3. What happened, your writer friend the writer friend of the protagonist is asking, what happens if you don't click? And I assume that's got to be a fear that so many adoptive parents have. What if we bring this kid in, and even if it's a great kid, he or she is a great kid, and that bond doesn't form.
Yeah.
So and then the narrator says, quote, I'm not even going to imagine what you're suggesting to herself. She's saying, I can't even go there.
Yeah.
Because it's so daunting, even that possibility, right?
Yeah. So even though I had no agenda about this, I mean, I did do a lot of thinking about these questions and these fears as these characters and as people in life experience them. And that was one thing that was really interesting to me about this kind of adoption, that I think you're more present to the full range of possibilities, including the ones where you're like, how could I even live with myself if that happened? When you meet someone and you say, well, these other 5 people already tried.
Right.
I could
what makes
judge
us
them.
think?
Right. I could judge them and say, well, they just must not have been great, loving people. But what if they were, and they really tried, and that was their best shot, and they're living with the unimaginable? What makes me think that is number 6? And then you had to just decide that you're going to live with that possibility.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me was for the would-be parents in this situation, that question is like live and in front of them. Whereas to a lot of parents who are giving birth or having biological children, I mean, I don't know because I haven't, but it seems like the assumption is that of course they're going to have that bond, and of course they're going to love this child unconditionally. Yeah. Which actually, though, is not guaranteed in that situation either.
Yeah. Yeah. But we assume.
Yeah. But there's some. I'm very influenced by Buddhism in my writing life as well as in my personal life. And, we go around living with these delusions and these false assumptions.
I don't. But I hear that a lot of people do. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of them, though, that if you have a biological child, you're very in control of that situation, and the bond is going to naturally happen, and it's going to be a beautiful relationship. Whereas if you do this other kind of bonding, it's going to be more risky. I mean, I don't know how you could statistically quantify the risks, but, just this situation just kind of removes the veil.
Yeah. Removing the veil. Okay, so let's talk about the system. What are some of the challenges that you learned about the system? And I have a list here that I can help you with. But just off the top of your head, because there's so much about the system that's just kind of insane. Right. I mean, it's kind of the worst of bureaucracy in a lot of ways. And then, so what did you learn, and what did the characters learn? The couple, what did they learn as they embark upon this journey? Some of the highlights.
Well, the thing that ends up being the most difficult for the narrator of the book, the woman, is just the level of surveillance. Yeah. That there's a lot of players in the mix, and you're, again, like why this was right for fiction, trying to create this intimate bond, and also have authority of I'm going to be the parent now and step up to that. And meanwhile, you've got 2 or 3 social workers, mental health care workers, various therapists, CASAs. You've got all of these people watching. It's an intense way to try to make an intimate bond.
Right. And sometimes they're competing with each other. Sometimes these agencies they're giving the protagonists, the couple, conflicting information. They're sort of competing for authority. And then, so the couple's kind of like you said, first of all, we want to have this intimate connection. How can we do that when we're being watched by 5 different state or national or county entities. But then on top of it, when they're getting conflicting information, and then one thing that was really interesting along these lines, a particular sort of angle on this, or not angle, but aspect of this was the, I'm scrolling in my notes to remember the name, the new paradigm. Can you talk to that a little bit? That's the thing. It sounded like it was probably, again, this is where fiction and nonfiction meet. Tell me a little bit about that, because that just drove me crazy.
This is like the only place I can talk about this
legitimately.
Because
yeah.
So that was part of my research from both being a parent in this situation myself prior to writing the book, and then also working on the book, doing more research on this. I actually wrote a column recently about this book, and it wouldn't get published by the particular publication.
Interesting.
Because
it's too touchy sort of thing, or?
Too touchy.
Interesting.
For the parenting section, which needs to be softer and just, you don't want to get into like investigative journalism.
Yeah.
But it turns out that this particular parenting book, set of parenting books by an author. I mean, I can say his name here. It's B. Brian Post, and he co-authored a book called Beyond Logic and Consequences, and then he has a series of his own parenting books. They are dominate. They're often recommended in the field. And then it turns out there's been a Virginia pilot expose about him advertising himself with false credentials and being ordered to desist in that.
Okay, so that part of the story is true.
That part is true.
Yeah.
That part is true.
Yeah.
And so certain players may be pushing certain parenting books or parenting advice very hard. And if you're the would-be adoptive parent in this situation, you're being told, well, we all hope that this adoption is going to go through, but we can't guarantee that it will. It's also in part the court that decides. And I have the power to move the child to another placement. And you're thinking, well, what happens if they don't see me following this parenting book to the letter that I can't stomach?
Well, and in the book, and I suspect this is true, but in the book you talk about, or the narrator talks about how a woman, I think a foster parent or an adoptive parent, I think it was in Virginia, didn't follow the book, and the child was taken away from them. I don't know if that really happened.
That's true. So if you Google Virginia pilot, B. Brian Post, all of the documented things about this will come up. even though
he was exposed as not necessarily being qualified to write these kind of books, agencies were still requiring foster parents and adoptive parents to follow his guidelines.
Yeah.
Which adds, again, to the point of the confusion that these poor parents who are trying to do this are subjected to. I mean, what better example of just mixed messages? And should we really be doing this or not? But they're making us do this. If we don't do it, even though now we know he's not an expert, we might lose the kid. So I guess we should. The thing that you quote in the book, or cite in the book, which again, I don't know if this part's fiction or nonfiction, is that this guy apparently said that they need to, that parents, it's funny, but it's horrible. So it's really not funny. But that parents should be drinking from baby bottles at the dinner table?
Yeah.
There was something like that?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's also documented in the news article.
Wow.
Interesting though, just all of this stuff being so subtle and difficult, and that's why it makes it good fiction.
Yeah.
In real life, I have actually found that the most important thing in this kind of adoption is making this intimate physical connection, which could be something like drinking baby bottles to get like things that sound
absurd
crazy and absurd that you would do with a 10 or 11-year-old actually can be highly like or the only thing that makes that kind of bond.
Interesting.
But where it becomes difficult is, how can you force that kind of intimacy on someone?
Yeah.
I mean, so they have to come to it in their own way.
Yep.
In my own life, not in the book, there was a moment where I found myself in a room with 5 different players in the system and 2 on speakerphone. And we were talking through something that had happened in our family life. And I suddenly just said, oh my God, I understand now. There's an inherent tension here. There's me needing to step up and say, I am this child's parent. I know what she needs. I'm just going to claim that. I don't need anyone else. I am the ultimate authority on this.
Right.
And there's all of you doing your jobs and trying to be protective and within your constraints and needing to oversee me. And we're both in the positions that we're in because we have to be.
And ostensibly for the best interest, in the best interest of the child.
In the best interest of the childhood.
Right.
And yeah, and yet somehow I've got to break it. I've got to just step up.
Yep. Yes. Okay. You don't realize it, but that was an amazing segue.
Oh.
Because my next section here is about tension. And so it's not surprising, given the themes, given the system, given the trauma, all these different things we've already talked about, that there's tension from start to finish in this book, and a sustained tension. And when we met at the Stranger Than Fiction reading series, you read from a passage from somewhere in the middle of the book, not in the beginning. And then when I saw you read a second time, and I joked, "Oh, you're not going to read the same passage you did last time," not intending to be an ass, but ultimately being an ass because you were like,
helpful.
You were like, "Oh, actually, I was going to," and then you got up and you didn't. And selfishly, I am glad that you didn't, because you read the very beginning of the book the second time. And I told you this afterwards, but I was surprised that tension that I had heard in that piece from the middle of the book at the first reading, I heard that right from the get-go in this book. And when you did the reading from the beginning, and I thought, oh, that's impressive. She starts off with that, and then I read the book, and you maintain it throughout the whole book. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. I'm going to quote a couple of the reviews. Jamie Quattro, author of I Want to Show You More, said, quote, "I often had to stop reading to catch my breath." Now, ordinarily, if I read that as a review, I would think that's hyperbole, but it's not. I mean, the book is very... And then Julie Shears, author of Jesus Land, says, quote, "This book reads like a thriller." So can you talk to me about, and this is part of, I want to know just in general, but then selfishly, I want to know from a writing perspective, from a craft perspective a little bit, about how you not only create that tension, but sustain that tension. Because that could be really, you could blow that. You know, you could overdo it, you could underdo it. And usually that sort of tension comes in sort of bursts. And here it's very even, and I'm on edge most of the time that I'm reading this book. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the two things that were really helpful craft-wise, the Pontilist idea that I was telling you about, that, okay, I'm never going to conflate things here, but there's just going to be a moment of something really painful, a moment of something really beautiful, painful, beautiful, and they exist and they keep going side by side. So that keeps the tension. The other thing I discovered, part of the impetus was feeling, I have an opportunity here, and it's kind of a hard choice, to write about this in an unsentimental way, which I think is ultimately going, I hope, to reveal some truth. And that is kind of a hard decision, because when you're writing about children, we tend towards sentimentality because we love children, because we should.
Because they're innocent.
Because they're innocent, because they are vulnerable.
Right.
And yet, when we get so accustomed to that sentimentality, it has a way of covering up certain truths that coexist with the more beautiful things. And so I was really thinking, maybe this could do something that I find useful in the world to remove that sentimentality. And so then what helped was to think of, okay, the first pass on writing this full draft, which I decided also to write quickly, and I think that helped. That just pressured the selection of the scenes and the moments, and helped me just really walk that plot line in a tight way. I wrote it in a whole draft in 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had thought it was 7 or 8, and then I went back to my notes the other day and going through those journals that I just told you about. I put in a fire safe. I realized
now
it was
safe and sound. In case anyone is worried, we have established they are safe and sound in 3 different safes. Yeah.
But on that draft, I thought I had to write dialectically against the sentimentality. So this is where, because I actually feel like we only know truth by untruth. I mean, I feel like we don't know truth in itself, but when we see something that's untrue and we call it out, then we know truth burningly, by contrast.
Now you're getting a little Buddhist again, I think.
I know.
Yeah. But I get it. Yeah, I get it.
And so with that first draft, I thought, I'm going to just write as against this. I'm going to have a sense of what the sentimentality would be, and I'm going to write against it.
Interesting.
And then in the next draft, I started bringing in the beauty And then I could kind of calibrate it to keep the tension.
Mm-hmm. That is fascinating. And I think you did an amazing job of that calibration. Like I said, that was one of the things that really just stood out for me. So thank you for sharing that. A couple other questions since we're now on craft. And we alluded to this earlier, or mentioned this earlier, but we didn't explore this. Just a little bit more about, I don't know, maybe we have talked enough about how you wrote it from the perspective of the narrator. But could you elaborate maybe a little bit more, though, on this shifting perspective that she uses, going from addressing her husband to Marisa, and then that was just interesting to me, that shifting perspective, and how, again, from sort of a craft perspective, the challenges of that and the choice to do that. Just some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, the choice of that is part of what made it work, I think. Like part of what I was conscious of, okay, this is a constraint on it that's really going to help me get this draft down.
Yeah.
And it was
in 6 months.
Yeah.
By the way,
will never happen in my life again.
Don't say that. Don't say that. Okay. There's a theme here in the book that we're not going to talk about, but there's a theme of not jinxing things, right?
Right.
So don't jinx it, because you said that like 3 times. That's it. 3 times the charm. Let's just throw out, this could happen again. You can have an idea that's this like contained, and that is just this, and you crank out a draft in 6 months because the idea is just so right. It could happen again.
You know, you're right.
Let's throw that out there.
Never rule out possibilities.
No.
You're right.
Okay. Now that I've got you back on track with that, you were saying about perspective and the 2 different.
Oh, and so actually, though, that was in large part inspired by Ginny Ophel. I mean, I want to give due credit to the influence of other writers in finding your models and embracing them and not being afraid to do that, and then hoping they approve later. but Ginny Ophel's Department of Speculation was a book that I just loved when it came out. And so the spareness of that book, but then also the way she used point of view to enact the conflict. She also uses a woman addressing her husband at the outset, although she doesn't do it to the it kind of falls off, and you sort of just feel like you're just reading. Then you lose your awareness of that addressee more in her book. And then what she does is she reaches a moment in the plot where the husband has cheated on her, and she shifts point of view. It's no longer an I speaker. It becomes the wife and she, and that enacts the woman feeling in shock and disassociated from herself and outside of herself.
Yeah, that sounds powerful.
And it's amazing. Yeah. And then when she comes back, when she gets over the shock, that's when it re-enters the first person. And then she makes a few kind of overt references to thinking about point of view within that novel. And so I read that book honestly 6 times while I was writing this one to channel certain elements of it. And so then that was what sort of gave rise to, okay, well, what if she's trying to talk to her husband, and then she's trying to talk to this little girl, Marisa, and then she's trying to figure out, how do I go from me speaking to you and me speaking to you to all of us having a connected relationship?
Triangulating, I think, is, you talk about the triangle at some point at least. Yeah. So you just mentioned, the last question sort of specific to craft, you just mentioned, I don't know exactly how you said it, writing sparingly, I think is what you were saying, something along those lines. And again, the pointillism, I say it different. You say it differently.
Your French is much better than mine.
No, I don't
speak French.
No, I'm assuming you're saying it better, but how do you say it?
I said pointillism, but it's probably wrong.
I just assumed it was pointillism because it's little points.
I think you're right.
So I could be no, but do you realize, quick aside, first of all, I want to say hi, Susan, Aaron, and Matthew. Matthew's just joined. But I was saying the title to my new book wrong for like 6 months. So I don't know, that's embarrassing too, because now it's recorded everywhere. So you might be right. I don't know. But anyway, what was I trying to get there? The point, so my question, total distraction. My question though was about the sparingly, writing sparingly. And I loved, and again, I don't know, maybe there's nothing to add here, but I loved how you structured each chapter is sort of a moment, right? And then there's little section break after little section break. So each little section within a chapter is 2 or 3 paragraphs, sometimes more. Any other comments on that? Or I don't know, again, maybe we've kind of covered that. I liked that, really kept things moving. It did keep it spare, but with enough and condensed. It's like you got what we needed to get in those moments, which of course is so hard to do, right? To get it down to those, just the essential.
Yeah.
And you said you wrote really quickly, and that was part of it. Anything else to add, or have we kind of covered that?
Oh, no, I mean, that is my method. And that is where a lot of the work goes, is to finding that one image or that one word that shows it. I mean, it's the show don't tell cliche, but
it's so true.
And to me, my own take on it is I want things to always be 3-dimensional. So I want it to be that I, as author, and then the reader, we are sort of standing next to each other, both looking at what is being put into the space of the story. I don't want to be explaining things to the reader. I want them to see what I have decided to show them. We are side by side looking at what I put in that space.
Right.
And so for that to work, I need to get it down to that spareness so that that one charged thing can be there to look at.
Yeah. So again, in the one thing for me that I think created some of the tension, in addition to what you've already described, is there's a lot of back and forth. And what I mean about like a certain idea or issue and along the lines of what you were just saying, but we're experiencing it with the narrator, and she's trying to figure out, again, whether X is going to happen or whether Y is right or whatever, again, the issue or challenge might be. But because we're experiencing with her, we don't get the answer, so we share her tension. And so a couple things, there are several, but a couple things just to call out of examples of that back and forth while I was sort of on the edge of my seat. First of all, there's the question, of course, the couple is, are we going to adopt or not? That's the obvious big question. But Marisa is also sending them really mixed signals, which just further, as if it's not already complicated enough. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because that was interesting as well.
Well, that was another one of those elements where I was like, oh, this is why this is good for fiction. Because the assumption would be the cliche of it, the prefabricated idea of this scenario would be that the child just wants permanent parents.
Right.
And
straightforward.
That's partly true, but it's not the whole truth. Because if you're a person who has learned how to be an independent operator and for your survival, but that sort of freedom and self-possession, you don't want to give that up. Yeah. And so you're going to be at war within yourself. There's going to be moments where you really want to compromise to be part of this family, because it is a huge compromise to become a part of a family. And even for a 7-year-old child, there's going to be moments where you're like, actually, I was pretty happy being an independent operator. I don't want to do this.
Well, and especially if she's already been, or any foster child's already been in multiple families, that have not worked out, they're not going to just assume, I would guess, that family 5 or 6 is the right one. They're probably going to be that much more reticent to trust that this is the right one. And so, and I'm just thinking out loud now, I hadn't really thought of this beforehand, but so part of that is probably testing this. I knew she was testing the couple, obviously, but probably testing to see, okay, is this really the family that I want to settle with? Yeah.
And then, but also, like, it's hard to even know. And this is, I mean, a 7-year-old doesn't, even if
they're not thinking in those.
And also, like, I thought it interesting, the woman, the narrator, with her ex-husband, who she tested in those ways. Even at 22, actually, it's not that different. You don't know, when am I testing this versus when do I actually just want to still be an independent operator?
Right.
There's so many recesses of your mind that.
And I loved that parallel too. I loved how you made those parallels, and I'm going to say more of that because it's so interesting. I want the readers to experience that. I do want to throw out one quote though that Marisa says, just to give listeners and viewers an idea of the kind of things that she's doing, and also, but even more specifically, how it's a struggle for the narrator. On page 137, she says, quote, and this is the narrator speaking, "I think of our hardest day when Marisa drew a hurtful picture of the protagonist." Oh, sorry, that's you. That's not a quote. Let me try this over, okay? Quote, "I think of our hardest day." Okay, and so this hardest day is when she draws this horrible picture of her potential adoptive mom, and the mom is really hurt. So now going back to the quote, "I could not even look at you. And the next day, it was like you'd had amnesia. You're the best mommy." And suddenly I had amnesia too. So I love that because that quote just shows both sides of it, right? The mom is just hurt and devastated and angry and whatever the mixture of emotions. And then the next day the kid has moved on and she's being her cute little self. And so the mom moves on and it's just this tough situation to say the least. Okay. So, and that's just one example. But another really poignant sort of back and forth issue that's really central to this story is, so there's the question of whether or not to adopt. Obviously, that's the overarching one. But underlying that is the question of will they even like her and love her? So there's the thing about clicking. I guess this is just clicking only on much deeper. You know, at one point, I don't have a quote here, but at one point the protagonist is talking with her husband and basically she's like, yeah, you know, I love her. And the husband's not quite ready to say that. And he's not even sure he likes her because of all the stuff that they're putting them through. I just thought, okay. But then I guess my next point, though, related to that, besides the fact that whole part was interesting to me, is to me, it seems like that's really the question of whether or not that's an illustration and the representation of whether or not unconditional love is really possible. That question, right? She's put us through all of this, and I'm not even sure I like her. Never mind, can I actually love her given all this? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do have a thought on that because this was something that was really important to me. I'm very influenced by Buddhism, but also by Christianity as I experienced it at Grace Cathedral Episcopal in San Francisco, which is very non-fundamentalist. Some people would even say relativist. And I'm like, yes, we are relativists because guess what? The life is very relative.
Yes.
But I was very influenced by that. And there was a preacher there named Dean Allen Jones. And he had a sermon that he would give often. He would touch on, you know, this idea of what if love is not a sentimental feeling? What does it mean to think of love as a policy instead of a sentimental feeling?
A policy.
Yeah. And so because feelings come and go, like everything. I mean, actually, everything that we experience, including our very selves, come and go constantly.
Right.
Feelings come and go. So if you're going to tie the idea of unconditional love to this wanting to be attached to someone or a stirring in the heart for someone,
setting yourself
that's
up.
not going to be there for any relationship. I mean, you are hopefully going to, you know, get to a point of bonding where you know, okay, I'm going to have these moments where I don't feel that, but I still have this obligation to you because I've decided that you are as important as I am to myself.
Right.
And that's where they need to get to. But those moments of the heart no longer fluttering are always going to happen.
Right. You don't want to get attached to that cute, innocent little girl as that being the source of the attachment. It's got to be the whole.
Yeah, I mean, there's a romance, and then there's a
there's the
deeper,
honeymoon period.
There's a honeymoon.
They talk about,
and a romance and a honeymoon are maybe, you know, passing stages on the way to love.
Right. Hopefully, in this case in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on here because we're definitely running out of time, but there are a couple things we have to talk about. So we're just going to keep going for a little while longer. And one of those things is, you know, we just talked about some of the backs and forths and how that keeps that tension going, and we're with the narrator and we're not sure. But another thing that's really distinctive is the befores and afters. There are a lot of very distinctive, and I'll throw out some examples. So there's the narrator's now ex-husband, which is the before, and then there's the after now with the current husband. There's Marissa's life before foster care and after once she's in the system, and then after being in the system, and then when she's potentially going to be adopted living with the family. There's married life before Marissa. There's married life after Marissa. And so this is all discussed kind of in those distinct terms. It's not just, sometimes you talk about the past. I mean, there's a lot of juxtaposition of that. There's even the husband goes from being Sebastian to daddy once she comes in. Again, showing this very clear-cut delineation in time and circumstance. So to me, it seems as if a lot of this book is about our relationship with the past and how the past influences the present and all of that sort of mingling and coming together. So my question to you, which is a huge one, so brace yourself, is why does the past matter?
Do you know that famous Faulkner quote? What is it? The past is never gone. It's not even past.
Can someone Google that for us?
No, I'm getting it incorrect.
Yeah.
But that's another quote that Dean Allen Jones liked to call on a lot.
Okay. But yeah, so in this context, because like I said, I know that's a whole podcast series ruminating on that. But just kind of thoughts on how it matters in this story or this context.
Well, I mean, I think just three people bringing all of who they are into trying to create this new relationship.
Yes. And so really my secret question here, the underlying question from that is, how does the past play into this idea of the unconditional love?
Oh boy.
And I'll ask even more specifically. So is it necessary to deal with or overcome our past in order to be able to experience and give unconditional love, which is really what I'm asking?
This is a really interesting question because, first off, to me, the book is also in large part about how important it is to be in the present. Mm-hmm. And what does it really mean to be in the present? And unconditional love actually being that coming into the present, is that part of the policy is just making a decision to be present with this person,
not judging based on the past.
And what do they seem to need from me now, and what can I give to them, and where is the boundary of self porous here? And really responding to just what's in front of you rather than the theory of what you're being told is in front of you, or what you think should be in front of you,
or what you're projecting,
projecting. So all of that, I mean, I think it's crucial to the three of them to be able to find a way to do that, to come to their bond.
Yep.
Let's see, what was the other part of your question?
That was really it. I was asking you that question in stages. My real question was, was that last one. Go ahead.
Well, just the other thing I think I find really interesting, again, I think my temperament as a writer is I really like to push back against assumptions. And when I find an assumption in the culture, then I know I have something to work with because I'm working against it. And so you were describing the narrator and her own trauma and these concerns about, is her own trauma going to be re-triggered? And one thing I was really interested in working with in this book is this idea that we have right now in our culture of trauma as defining us. Which I think,
so much, yep.
I think is well-intentioned because it's to honor that trauma does continue to play out in our lives and have profound effects on us. On the other hand, I feel like the culture takes it so far that it's as though like the person caught a virus that now you have PTSD forever, and this is who you are.
Exactly.
I am PTSD,
right.
And then you take it on as an identity, and that becomes can become self-fulfilling. And my fear is it can become self-fulfilling for foster kids who are capable of so much more resilience than we may realize if we're in this well-intentioned way trying to attach these disorders and identities upon them, which they then feel us projecting upon them, which they then take on as like, well, this must be my destiny, that I'm a broken person. Right. And so one interesting aspect of the narrator is that she honestly feels that even though she went through all of that in her childhood and saw her father murdered before her own eyes, that she has worked through it. She's in a profound way faced it, and it may still be present in her life, but it's not defining who she is, and it's not being re-triggered in ways that are sort of, driving her interactions with her relationships without her realizing it.
No, because she says, quote, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Well, she says, because sometimes with hard work, people do get over it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a quality of myself that I gave to this narrator.
Yeah.
Which I then had to again, try to drop the agenda and just work with it as a story element. But I thought it was an interesting story element because I thought the conventional way of telling this story would be about her having her own trauma re-triggered, and then it would be about how we're never really free of trauma and it becomes who we are, and it's this awful trap there. And I just have a more hopeful experiential sense of human capability
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to say really quickly, so we're already an hour and a half, but
oh, wow. I can't believe that.
I know. Isn't that good? That's a good sign, right? When we get to an hour and a half and don't know how it happened, that's a good sign. And I still have a couple other questions, and like I said, unless you have to go someplace, but I've got you trapped in here with the lights and stuff, so you can't go anywhere. I do want to throw out, though, if anyone has questions, now would be the time to throw them our way. I'm going to ask her a couple more things. So feel free to throw those our way on Facebook through direct message. But okay, I'm not going to give any spoilers away about the ending. I do just want to say, though, that I did not know how it was going to end. And again, I still had that tension of this could go either way, or this could go 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. And I thought you very adeptly and convincingly pulled off the ending. So thank you for that, crafted the ending. So the last big question I'm going to ask you, not quite as big as why is the past important, but close. Actually, maybe this is bigger. Brace yourself. I don't know. Maybe this is bigger. So you set off to write this novel as an exploration of unconditional love. Like that was one of the reasons you wanted to look at that theme. We know how the unconditional love plays out in the novel itself, in the story itself. Readers they'll see that firsthand. But what did you learn? How did it change your perception and understanding, if at all, I assume it did, of unconditional love, going through the process of actually writing this book? Did that change how you think of, see, experience unconditional love, including whether or not it's even actually possible?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because, so you were asking before about the difference between nonfiction and fiction. And this book does feel to me very different from the memoir. And that there wasn't a catharsis to writing this book for me. Whereas with the memoir about my father's unsolved murder, I really did feel like I was writing it because I had to figure out something about myself. Sure. Because I needed to have a catharsis that moved me out of one story in my life and into hopefully future stories of my life. And the book actually did that. And I think memoir is great for doing that.
Yeah.
Like, I always like to tell people, like, memoir is like, if it's therapy, great. It's therapy plus. You have art and therapy at the same time.
Right.
Let's embrace them both.
Just make sure you get good writing quality thrown in there.
Yeah, right.
As well.
That's right.
And then we're all good.
If you're doing your therapy and then the quality of it rises to the level of art, then I don't believe in that denigrating, like, well, memoir is just therapy. Because if it rises to the level of art, then it does. And if it had therapeutic effects too, then bonus.
Well, that's what we call a win-win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the case in writing the novel. There was nothing therapeutic or cathartic about it, but it was a kind of laboratory for me of thinking through these really challenging spiritual questions and coming to new ways of thinking about them. And so most of what I've been saying today is as a result of using this story as kind of a laboratory for those questions. And but I did come to feel that absolutely unconditional love is possible.
I'm glad that's your conclusion. All right, that's a great way to end today. We have just determined unconditional love is possible. I love that. And readers, listeners, watchers can come probably to that conclusion through reading this book themselves, or at least do a lot more reflection on their own related to that. I don't know firsthand anything about foster care or adoption. I don't know anything firsthand, but I will say that it's hard for me to imagine that this book wouldn't greatly benefit anyone who's thinking about it, who's already been through it, whether it's from an informational standpoint, from a sort of preparing them standpoint, from a things to think about standpoint, but then also, of course, just anyone who wants to read a compelling, engrossing, moving story. So thank you for sharing all that. And thank you for writing it. Thanks for coming here to talk about it today. Quick couple administrative questions before we sign off. So you just did a tour. You just did some readings. I know you've done a couple other podcasts. Is there anything imminent coming up that we want to share? Or I know you're back to writing a new book. So is that the focus, or are you still out making the rounds and we need to share anything?
No, I'm just primarily in the book. I am teaching at the Squaw Valley Community of Writers Conference in a couple of weeks, July, and reading and on panels there. And I will just say that's a great conference, along with Lit Camp Conference that you're also familiar with, that I've been to in the past. And so,
all right, let's keep him busy. Okay, so let me just throw out rachelhoward.com is your website. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. That is all for today. Thanks again to my guest, Rachel Howard, author of The Risk of Us. And I'm going to fix this microphone. It has been driving me crazy for the past hour and a half. No show next week, but the following week, June 30th, my guest will be Guide Dogs for the Blind CEO, Christine Benninger. Thanks to WordSpace Studios for hosting me. They, again, are at wordspacesstudios.com. Thank you for watching and listening. If you like the show, would you please share on social media and subscribe, rate, and review wherever you watch or listen? It really helps, and I really appreciate it. For more about me, my website is at matthewfelix.com, and links to my social media, books, other podcasts, and all the rest can be found there. If you have any comments, ideas for the show, or just want to say hello, I can be reached at felixonair@matthewfelix.com. Thanks again for watching and listening, and have a great week.